So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to introduce all of you, and you can always add something if I'm missing anything. But since there's a lot of people in this panel, I want to make sure we can go through the content. So I'm just going to take a minute to introduce each and every one of you, and then Fran is going to give us a little summary of the 2 days before we start the questions. So I'm just going to follow my list on of the speakers, so it's just alphabetical order from the first name. So I'm going to start with Alan Gershenfeld. Hi, Alan. You muted. I don't know if I can.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks so much for being with us. So Alan is president and co-founder at Eline Media. You're also co-founder of Experimental Design and co-author Designing Reality, and you're also former chairman for Games for Change. I don't know if you all know Games for Change. I think a lot of people here know about Games for Change, and you also probably know Eline Media if you played game Never Alone, for example. It's very successful and very lovely game that was from Eline Media. Thank you so much for being here, Alan. Do you want to add something else?
Yeah, before Games for Change, I helped rebuild and was head of studios at Activision, which I think is relevant to this conversation in terms of a AAA developer and publisher.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks for writing this. Carlos Figueiredo. Hi, Carlos.
Hi there.
How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here with us. So Carlos is director of player safety of Minecraft, so Mojang Studios and Microsoft. So I'm sure everybody knows Minecraft. He's also co-founder of the Fair Play Alliance. So it's a very interesting global coalition of gaming professionals and companies. It's aiming to develop and share best practices and encouraging healthy communities and player interactions in online gaming, free of harassment, discrimination, and abuse. So that's very important. Hi, Carlos. Do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, just a little bit about my origins, if you will, in the industry. For anybody who knows the game Club Penguin, back when that was a Disney game, that's where I started my journey in online safety. So it has been 15 years, and yeah, again, a pleasure to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, Club Penguin was a huge hit back in the day. Next on my list, I have Crevoshay. Hi, Eve. Sorry, I'm saying it in the French way.
I'll take either.
How you doing?
Good. That's good to be here.
So, Eve is the executive director of Take This. So Take This is a mental health nonprofit decreasing stigma and increasing support for mental health in games. We've seen wonderful talks from a couple of people from Take This. I think it was 2 researchers, right? Yeah, I think we had 2 people. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I'll just say that our perspective from as a mental health organization is relatively broad, and that's because we think structurally and about what are the cultural and structural factors inside games that contribute to or detract from well-being. And that's why ethics in games is so much a part of the conversation for us. And so it's not just about people, but it's also about systems and structure and larger factors at play. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Eve. Next on my list, I have Kate Edwards. Hi, Kate.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good.
I like your Star Wars background. So Kate is CEO and principal consultant of Geography. So it's a game culturalization consultancy. It's very important, and not too many people are doing that. I in fact only know Kate who's doing this. She's also CXO and co-founder of SetJetters, former executive director of the International Game Developers Association, IGDA, and of the Global Game Jam. Do you want to add anything, Kate?
Just that this topic's very relevant. I mean, when I worked for Microsoft for 13 years, where I established a team to handle cultural and geopolitical risk. And one of the things that I ended up doing was I was one of the 5 member team that wrote the code of ethics for Microsoft. When they approached me to do that, they I was kind of surprised because that was 20 years into the existence of the company and they had no code of ethics yet. But it was also coincided with the time when the DOJ in the United States was doing an anti-monopoly case against Microsoft. So they kind of figured they need a code of ethics. But I'm also on several boards, including Take This, you know, and on the Fair Play Alliance advisory board and so on.
Thanks, Kate. Next on my list, Katherine Lowe. Hi, Kat. How are you doing?
Good. I'm glad to be here. It's a
Thanks
very
for
important
being
issue.
So Kat is doing content moderation for Meetin. You're a lead there. So Meetin is a technology not-for-profit that builds software and programmatic initiatives to strengthen journalism, digital literacy, and accessibility of information online and offline. So that's pretty important. And you're also a visiting researcher at UC Irvine in informatics. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Center for Responsible, Ethical, and Accessible Technology, which is CREATE for short. It's great. Yeah, and a lot of my background comes from counseling and working with people who are the targets of abuse and seeing the worst of it online. And I guess I'd like to say, like, there's like a phrase or a concept that like one of the best ways to understand a system or the underpinning of a system is from below. So I think it has been a really valuable perspective, also being from the side of working with folks who, and by the way, I want to say not professional counseling. I'm talking more about the sort of support work for you know, people who've had to see the worst parts of games and other players.
Yep. Right, next up is Miles Ludwig. Hi, Miles. Thanks for being here.
Celia, thanks for having me. How you doing?
I can barely hear you. Can you try to?
Oh, I know what's happening. I'll fix it.
Okay.
I've seen it before. Just let me
All right.
find the
Do
setting.
you want me to introduce Régis instead and come back to you later?
Oh,
All right, let's do that. I'm going to introduce Régis Chatellier first. Hi, Régis.
Hi everyone.
Good. How are you doing?
I'm fine.
So Régis is Innovation and Foresight Project Manager at the CNIL's Innovation Laboratory. So CNIL is a French data protection authority, is the Commission Nationale de l'Informatique et des Libertés. So in English, it's National Commission on Informatics and Liberty. It's an independent French administrative regulatory body whose mission is to ensure that data privacy law is applied to the collection, storage, and use of personal data. For example, GDPR. And more specifically, the Foresight Committee, and I'm a member of it for full disclosure, is here to strengthen, the goal is in order to strengthen its monitoring and foresight tasks, the CNIL directs a committee of non-CNIL experts comprised of 18 members. Is that correct, Régis?
This is correct. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything?
No, just what is interesting, I hope it can be interesting for you, is that the fact that many issues in video games, but not only video games, are linked with data protection and personal data. That's why we are not focused on ethics, but maybe we can have some views that could be interesting today in our panel. I hope so.
And Miles, are you ready for us, Miles?
Mic
So
check,
Miles,
mic check. One,
Yes.
two, sibilance. Can you hear me?
it works better. Thank
Awesome.
you. So Miles is Vice
Thank you.
President of Digital Media at Sesame Workshop. So Sesame Workshop is an American nonprofit organization, has been responsible for the production of several educational children's programs, including its first and best known Sesame Street, that has been televised internationally. Thank you, Miles. Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think the absence of functioning ethical norms actually in gaming, it really limits what we can do with children under 13. If we could get to a safer more functioning space, then we could do all kinds of amazing things and tackle different kinds of educational challenges that right now today we just can't, because the system is just not there. So it's super exciting and relevant topic, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I hope we can move a little bit the needle here. It's pretty an informal panel, as I said earlier. We're just going to throw a bunch of questions there and see what comes out of there. So thank you so much for doing this, because it's not easy to have such panel. Before we get right into it, I would like to ask Fran if she can just do a little summary, like a 1-minute summary of both days and all the topics that were covered. I know it's hard to do.
Want to start off that I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist who has spent most of her time researching and considering all the good that video games can do for children's cognitive development. So the past 2 days has been incredibly enlightening about how ethics needs to come into play in the game sphere. I'll give just a general gloss of the past 2 days. I will say from the onset that the focus on game ethics came from both an academic standpoint and also from a game industry standpoint, but we didn't see a lot, and maybe this is early days, we didn't see a lot of the nexus of the two spheres, which is something that clearly needs to happen. There was a lot of discussion about toolkits, guidelines, lived experiences that could help to inform how game developers actually ensure that no harm is done to game players as they play. There was a lot of focus on what are game effects, for example, toxicity, microtransactions, and overall harmful behaviors on marginalized groups as a result of gameplay. There was also a focus on remedies for these ethical breaches, and also some very innovative consideration of how AI can be used to detect toxicity as reflected in the game chat that goes on in many multiplayer games. That was a very interesting trend for the talks this second day. Lots of different research methods used, largely mixed methods, including autoethnography, focus groups, content analyses. There was also discussion about the legal ramifications of ethical breaches in gameplay. This is a very large gloss, but I'm sure that all of you have your own take on how game ethics should be considered from a game developer standpoint, and also game effects on players.
Thank you so much, Fran. So with this, we're gonna start our get right into the meat of the topics here, and we're gonna start from the game developers' point of view. First of all, because game developers are the least amount of people that we've heard so far throughout the 2 days, but also because Alan has to leave a bit early. And also, thank you so much, Alan, for making the time to join us. As soon as you need to leave, you don't have to, tell me if you have to go, you just go. So we're going to start from the game developer's point of view. And my question to you, and I took a look at the the survey and what people were saying. So of course, it was only 11% game developers who answered the survey. It was mostly scholars, of course, and academic people, since the conversation is mostly coming from there. But game developers said they think it's good for players. They also think it's good for game developers. But they were more doubtful that it could be enforced. And so what is your opinions, Alan, Carlos, Kate, and anyone who's been working in the gaming industry as game developers, what do you think are the main challenges of, first of all, putting together a code of ethics, how to get there and to enforce it? So Alan, if you want to start, if you have any ideas on this.
Yeah, I'm going to start by zooming back just a little bit, if that's okay. Interestingly, my oldest brother, I want to do a shout out to him. He specializes in things like creating charters and code of ethics in lateral eco non-hierarchical systems. So what does that mean? Trade groups, governance of the internet, which is really kind of what we're talking about here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology that I've worked on with him and other things and relate it specifically to a developer publisher answer to your question. So to me, the first step is identifying the stakeholders. And I think that's really important. And there are a lot of stakeholders outside developers, publishers, players, parents, trade groups, investors, regulators, researchers. But I'm going to focus on the industry because that is the focus of the panel. Even within the industry, there are different stakeholders. The leadership of AAA companies, the top creative talent of AAA companies, and employees are actually different stakeholders. The indie sector is different than the AAA sector. Folks who focus on mobile games versus PC console games, some overlap, but not complete overlap. As Miles mentioned, developer publishers who focus on under 13 is different than over 13. So I do think rather than looking at developers and publishers as one body, really understanding who the stakeholders are is important in identifying them. Second is identifying the interests, and I think that's the meat of your question. What are the interests of the different stakeholders? Where do they align and where do they overlap? And I'll mention a few that I think are maybe intuitive, but in some ways not totally intuitive. So clearly one interest is making money or saving money. That tends to cross most of the commercial industry. And I think the folks from Fair Play can speak to this, but because toxicity in the gaming community at Riot was becoming such a business issue where they weren't able to attract new players, they saw that as something that they need to address from a business perspective to grow their market segment. And, that was part of the genesis that I think emerged into what is a very exciting industry alliance, Fair Play. Another thing that I think folks are interested in is obviously improving the player experience. Players are happy, the businesses tend to do well. So that's an interest. Another interest that I wouldn't underestimate, and I think both Fair Play and Playing for the Planet, which is, I think, another a successful alliance in the game industry, UN inspired around commercial companies that are making environmental commitments. I've been very active in that one. I would argue in many ways that one grew out of an interest among employees who had a passion about environment and games, not necessarily the top leadership at these companies. There were a few, but it was often employees. Now, the top leadership at companies have to keep their top talent happy and motivated. And so if part of keeping top talent motivated is recognizing that they care about a code of ethics or they care about the environment, that's an interest. And then there's reducing liability. I think Kate just alluded to this, that Microsoft had a concern about reducing liability during those hearings. So that's an interest. That's a real interest. I could list more, but I think identifying the stakeholders, identifying the interests, and then identifying alignment and misalignment is a key step towards developing a code of ethics. Now, obviously, it's much stronger if the industry is involved in that process. If they're not involved in that process, it's going to be less successful. And when I talked to my brother about the surveys, I was very interested in the survey, and I want to dive in deeper. He said, in many ways, the two most important questions is, how important is this to you? And how difficult do you think it would be to implement? And if it's really important and not that difficult to implement, you got low-hanging fruit. I don't think that's the case here. So I'll pause there. I'll just mention one other thing. When I left Activision after helping to build the studios there and was seeing the billions of hours of lean forward engagement, I got very interested in how we can create more value and mitigate more harm. There's been a lot in creating value for games for learning, health, social impact, but much less in terms of mitigating harm. So I think this is really important and really exciting. And I think having an aspirational code of ethics that because we're a long way from monitoring and enforcement, and that could be a whole conversation, but having an aspirational code of ethics is a big step forward that people can start discussing. And then as I mentioned in the second one, employees at companies will start to embrace it, and it can bubble up internally. And in many ways, I think that's the way Playing for the Planet had success. It was a very light touch in terms of the requirements for the companies. And a lot of employees were like, we should do this, we should do this. And now I think there's 40 companies that are part of the alliance. I think that's somewhat similar with Fair Play. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this insight. Since we were talking about the Fair Play Alliance, Carlos, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, absolutely. So much great insights from what Alan said. So I'll stick to a few things and try to build upon it. I definitely agree, Alan, that understanding motivations and goals from the different people we need to involve in the conversation is absolutely critical. And while I agree with you that the business is a chief motivation that needs to be taken into consideration, I have to say the genesis of the Fair Play Alliance wasn't business. It was something that we stumbled upon in the practice of the Alliance the more we talked to each other. But the genesis was really this shared aspiration. You used the word aspiration, and I love that word. It was a shared aspiration for designing games that are conducive to pro-social behavior, designing games that are conducive to a thriving community. That was the genesis, right? Like it really came from a aspirational point of view of a dream, really. And then we stumbled upon the conversation, really understanding that one of the main barriers across many companies to implement positive social systems and make sure that safety was top-notch, a lot of those barriers was understanding the relationship between that and business outcomes. So for sure, there's that there. But I gotta say, after 15 years in the industry, I prefer thinking that this is the right thing to do. You know, we're talking about ethics, and we're living in an increasingly unsafe world in a lot of senses. And games can be a safe haven for a lot of people. I really believe in that as well. I've seen a lot of good in games, and I'm not here trying to be hand wavy and say that we don't have problems in games, but I'm saying we should lean into this positive element of games and be aspirational, as you said, Alan. How can we aspire to have something that we all share as values, as principles that will guide our practice? And just before I finalize here, I wanted to talk a little bit about barriers. And I think one of the key barriers to implementing something like this is even understanding our biases. When we talk about ethics, do we run the risk of really over-indexing on Western ethics? I think so. I think we easily run that risk. And then not to necessarily tee that up for Kate, but I will now stop talking because I understand Kate has a much better, deeper experience in this area of just global thinking.
Well, I think we were probably going to address that in another question, but what I did want to respond to, because for both of you giving great insights, the one thing that I think is important to point out, and to go back to my comment about helping to write the Microsoft Code of Ethics, you have to ask yourself, why did it take so long for something to be written in the first place? And I think part of the barrier is that when you're talking to C-level people about these things, to say, hey, we need a code of ethics. What I think for the optics on that, for a lot of people internally and externally, is that why do we need a code of ethics? Are we doing something wrong? And that's often that perception is that, oh, we need a code of ethics because something was uncovered. Somebody did something that went off the rails, and now we need to contain it by actually coming up with a code of ethics. And that's been my experience in some of the companies I've worked with, is that to take that step, as good and positive as it is, can also be seen as like an implicit admission of some kind of guilt that may or may not even be in existence. But so they tread very, very carefully around this in terms of whether or not this is something that because like even when I was approached to do the Microsoft task, it was kept extremely secretive because at the time they did not want people to know that we actually did not have an official code of ethics. But if you went through the internal website, you would not find anything. So I think that's part of the barrier too, is that they have to navigate those optics issues. But it all depends on the marketing of it. You know, they could like fully embrace, as many companies have done more, for example, with DEI issues and DEI initiatives in their company, they embrace those as something that they, you know, this is a reinforcement of our values and what we stand for. And I think the ethical argument needs to be the same, but I still think it's a little bit more, it's not quite the same as the DEI issues, because I think the DEI approaches, for example, are an easier thing to embrace and more universally accepted. Whereas with the ethics issue, I still think you have that implicit liability that they're really worried about.
Thank you so much, Kate. You've been great in segues so far. Just for context, I mentioned that earlier, but I did not repeat it at the beginning of the panel. So Kate Edwards, Katherine Lowe, Carlos Figueiredo, and myself started in 2020 the ethicalgames.org initiative. So we put together a draft, an aspirational draft, as Alan was saying, to try to address broadly what a code of ethics could look like. And yeah, and to speak to Alan's comment, it's really hard to define something that would be global to all the different games and all the different situations. But the idea is to try to stay as broad as possible, and then maybe after that we could try to think of specific guidance for specific situations. So this is for the context. Does anyone want to add up to what has been said so far?
I would love to. I think this has been a really, gosh, it's so wonderful to hear from such smart and thoughtful people. I love the work that all of you have done and what you've said. I think what's so interesting about this juxtaposition of a business case versus ethic, like it's the right thing to do, is something that we've found. We recently did some work with Nielsen. We released some data around why players, you know, how many players are not playing or are playing less or spending less because they experience toxicity online, right? And the numbers are really high. Is that the two go hand in hand? The right thing to do serves people. And when people are served, they are happier and they tend to stay engaged and stay present and spend more money. And I think the same is true on the developer side, that when developers are treated like human beings and well served, they do better work. We know that we know all the data around psychology and around well-being and health research is that when people are healthy and are treated well and are not burnt out and feel safe psychologically, then they are better at their jobs and they can sustain it for longer. So the one thing follows the other, right? You treat people well, you recognize their humanity, and then from that comes something better. And I also want to touch on something that Kate was saying around the industry kind of not wanting to say something publicly and being very, very afraid of the blowback. And that's a feature in games that has been around for a very long time. And this fear of the blowback, this fear of players, this desire to cater to them. And, you know, there's been some really harmful things that have come out of that in terms of the culture and expectations of players, the norms and behaviors of players. It's really concerning. And I want to say that we think about games as cultural assets of influence. And that means that games shape and reflect culture, right? All the time. But the player behavior, the dynamics around games is the same thing. They shape and reflect online culture and broader cultural norms. And so I think it's really, there's a moment here. And Carlos, I'm very sensitive to your comment about Western values being ascendant here. But I do think there's a moment here to think really critically about what is the culture that we want to reinforce, the norms that we want to set, and not just around content, and the way we treat people in studios, but around the behavior that we're encouraging. And that's why I also think Fair Play Alliance is amazing, and the work that you're doing is really exciting. Because if we can set new norms, we can change that cycle, that feedback cycle around what is acceptable among players, what is appropriate, and how we think about it. And I think, Miles, to your point at the beginning about, what's possible in this space and what's not because of the dynamics around it, that's where we're going to get to a place where we can really think differently about what's possible in this space. And I'm hopeful that the levers are starting to exist to press on around those things. But yes, we do have some ground to make up in that space.
Thank you, Eve. I think Kat wanted to jump on.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate Eve sort of calling out also the interplay between like online gaming spaces and just broader internet culture, and how this code of ethics really has like greater implications beyond just like, okay, specifically developing a particular game. And I think I like to look at this also through the lens of like implementation and measurement of these like code of ethics. So how are we expecting people to implement them? And how are we measuring the way that we're implementing these codes of ethics? That's why I also appreciate in like sort of summarizing this conference is like people are sharing toolkits, they're sharing standards, they're sharing like ways to think about in like more structured ways, more concrete, more granular ways of what it means to enact these code of ethics. And I think it's really important we think about connecting the code of ethics with the toolkits and standards and things that people have put together. And Fair Play Alliance has a bunch of really cool documentation as well. Because, thinking about it in terms of like these very concrete design implications and so on. And then thinking about the sort of back end element of it is like, what metrics are we collecting? What incentives do we have for collecting certain metrics? We're talking about business cases, and in many cases, metrics themselves end up introducing issues, right? It's like measurement is basically, or agreeing to measure something is agreeing to find out how not ethical you are. And I think Kate said something about, or it's like, you don't want to admit that you're screwing up, and by committing to measuring it, you are now promising to reveal how unethical you are, either internally or externally, like in terms of PR coverage, and reporting to investors, and also like Eve was pointing out, I think it's like the player base reacting to some of this. So transparency being thrown into the mix, I think really like adds is an important value, like having transparency about what you're doing, what's happening on your platform. But then it also adds that to the reluctance, perhaps, to identify like what you're doing wrong. So I think this code is so important for so many reasons, and there's so many ways we can think about making it sort of realized, and thinking about interpreting it, not just into the guidance, but also to the standards that we expect.
Alan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll make a few quick points. We could talk for hours. This is so interesting, but I'm going to make a few points, some directly related, some just to get in before I have to jump off. One thing I would encourage is looking at other sectors where code of ethics have evolved, often over 10 years, but like DNA sequencing, things that may not be obvious, I would encourage to look at, because these are complex sectors where code of ethics have actually emerged and even gotten to the point of monitoring and enforcement, either self-monitoring or external monitoring. So that's one thing I just want to throw. I don't know if that's been part of the conversation, but I think should be part of the conversation. The other thing I want to put out there as we talk about ethics is not everybody is in agreement on what is ethical and what isn't. And that is part of the identifying stakeholders, identifying alignment and misalignment. In some areas, there might be conclusive science. In other areas, the science could be emerging and conflicting. That is the nature of science. And so I wouldn't assume there is a monolithic ethic. In some areas, I think you can be stronger. In other areas, it's a little more murky. But I was going to just make a point about aspirational futures, because I've been thinking a lot about that. And we actually have a whole business focused on designing aspirational futures. That's half the puzzle, is having the collective vision of an aspirational code of ethics, which I think can emerge and should emerge. The way that I believe to emerge from aspirational to realizing the aspirations is actually rooted in game design theory, which is what makes games in some ways so engaging is you have a goal, let's call that the aspirational vision. Crucially, you have agency to act. You can fail safely. You get feedback. You get feedback as you pursue your goal. You get feedback from the game, from peers, from mentors. And it's that feedback loop that my agency made a difference towards the goal I'm invested in. Now I'll marry that to the code of ethics. If we can see, and I think we've touched on it on the last few comments, in areas where, say, we're reducing toxicity, and that is creating a better player experience, it's good for everybody, there's economic benefits, there's social benefits. Well, that's the feedback loop that a piece of the code of ethic, the agency is making a difference. And so rather than a monolithic view, seeing these areas where individually and collectively the actions are making a difference, it's critical to communicate that if it aligns with the interests. And that starts to build the stable steps towards a larger vision. So I just wanted to put that out there because interestingly, I think the insights of what make games work is relevant to how to turn a code of ethics into a reality.
Yeah, there's a lot to unravel there. Yeah, so to answer to the science, that's actually the whole point of this conference, to see the state of the science today, so that maybe we can find at least some elements that are what are the true harms, and what are the context, the very precise context, so then we can have more precise guidelines coming out of there. But yeah, there's a lot of elements to touch on. I think the economic arguments is going to have more weight, especially with the FTC. I don't know if you followed, like Epic Games had a fine from the FTC of $500 million. So that starts to be a lot of money. And so that's also another argument that has more weight there. I think I'd like to, there's so many things I'd like to talk about, and this is definitely not going to be the last conversation that we're going to have on the topic. The intent is to have many other discussions in the future, and also to invite a lot of other people so that the discussions can be diverse. It's not really the case of this panel today, but the idea is to really have this diversity in perspectives and culture. Unless someone wants to end on the game development side, I would like to talk about more the supervising and the compliance. Like if we manage to have a code of ethics, how can we make sure that we enforce it? So yes, we can assume that the aspirational win, and maybe some actors are just gonna sign up for that and by themselves do this. But we still have a lot of people who might not want to jump on voluntarily. And this is when regulatory bodies can have an impact. If, like, speaking of the FTC decision and the fine that Epic had to pay, that could be also not a way to approach it, but you know, if we have a code of ethics and we determine specific harms, then we can have laws and policies made out of it. So I would like to turn it on to Régis. Would you like to speak to that? You know, what do you think would be the challenges to enforce such a code of ethics? And maybe you can talk a little bit of what you've experienced so far in terms of data protection. What do you think here are the challenges?
I think here we have two different topics. One is the law, the other one is the ethics. And you know that in France, like NIL is responsible for GDPR, so for data protection. And we have also a mission under the French law for leading the debate on the ethical and social issues raised by digital technologies. And that's why we published a few years ago a report on the ethics of artificial intelligence algorithms. And we organize every year an annual ethics event. So our mission are not directly ethical, although the core of the European data protection rules is based on the fundamental rights, but it's a bit different. But I think that this kind of text and regulations, we have the GDPR for data protection, but now we have new regulation in Europe. We have the Digital Services Act for the contents. Digital Market Act, and tomorrow the AI Act. And I think that all these regulations are based on translating societal choices and sometimes ethical choices into law, but compliance is not negotiable. These are legal obligations, and it can be different with ethics. That's why I think that an ethical approach should be, in particular, just drafting of an ethical charter should be based on this framework, but must not be limited to compliance with the law. And it must be used, the law, as a basis for making better proposals, and that aim to do better, not just the bare minimum. Because we saw this with the data protection. When a few years ago in 2018, when we were like selling the GDPR to everyone, the idea was you have to be compliant, but try to do better and to use data protection as a business issue, just to show the people that maybe it can be positive for your business, not just a constraint. And we think that if the organizations, the game developer or others, can see the rules not as constraints but as opportunities and goals, maybe they can use the code of conduct and ethical charts within the organization to make the people aware of why we do this. And the example was with the GDPR. What was interesting, because we made some studies on the data protection awareness of the people, and we saw that the fact that we made it mandatory to understand what is data protection in organization made that the people in their personal life now are aware of the risks. And sometimes we saw that the people who had this as a constraint now know that it's for themselves, and they use the data protection for themselves. And it's really interesting to see that if you put the constraints within the company, it's also can be used for educate the people, and the same people will educate the others. That's why I think can be interesting. And just as an example, among the recommendation we made on artificial intelligence, one was the principle of vigilance and reflexivity. The idea was to ensure that ethical issues are methodical and deliberative, and not just the responsibility of an external ethics committee. And this is what we call the privacy by design in data protection, but it has to be by design in the companies, meaning that you have to work with all stakeholders within the companies to implement a dialogue on every part of the ethical charts. And that's why I think that it can be used in the company, or maybe in another organization, not just as a banner or a badge, but reintegrated into practices. And that's why I think that, just to conclude, and with the GDPR, the legislator has imposed on everyone in the organization the need to take care of the fundamental rights of customers or users, and could be used in the same way. The limit, I think, can be that the fact that to enforce it, it has to be a law. So I think the idea is not at the now to enforce it, but maybe to make that the people really take care of it, of ethics, because this is a difference. And as Alan said, we don't have all the same ethics, but we have to co-create it within the scope of the data regulation, which is sometimes which is based on ethics.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's resonating quite a bit. When I'm listening to accessibility specialists, they say, yeah, you have to be compliant with accessibility laws like the American with Disability Act. But that doesn't make it so that you think about an inclusive design. So that's why, yes, we need laws, especially to protect specific people. I'm thinking about children here and minors. But also the aspirational thing, like Alan was saying, is still going to be very important, so that people can design in an ethical way and think about it early on.
Just one thing in terms of enforcement. I don't know. It's not possible in every every field, but within the GDPR, you have code of conduct, which are a specific framework could be in video games based on GDPR within an organization, and they put some rules, and it can go farther than the GDPR with rules much more restrictive or open. And if they sign the code of conduct, then it can be enforced. So maybe sometimes we could take some part of the ethics charts to put it some code of conduct, and then you can enforce, but not all the ethics code.
Well, that's a great point.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Is that all right? Okay. I'm very sensitive to the different political environments that we're operating in, and how much more functional from a policymaking and like social engineering perspective the EU is than the US, for example. That these barriers are, I think, really significant in the US, that it's just not around and even developing a legal framework that isn't bare minimum. And so from my very American perspective, I feel like, well, this is yeah, I mean, it's Celia, it is absolutely a good start, right? But it is there's not a culture here of how do we do social engineering. It's a culture of how do we respond to the existing. And Alan, I see you've got you're unmuted. I'm very curious to hear your perspective here, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, so monitoring and enforcement. I mean, I think there's, in some ways, three big buckets. The goal is to get to behavior change, sort of repeated patterns of more positive behavior at an institutional and a company level. That happens over time. It doesn't have, there's no quick way to do that. Government regulation, you can look at the most extreme, which would be China. Again, it's a different context, as you were saying, Eve, it's a different political context that they're able to do that. But government regulation exists in every country in different forms. And you can look, it's hard for government regulation. Institutions don't move as fast as industry. Industry is constantly changing. There's new research, there's new challenges, but it's a tool in the toolbox. And it's different in each government context. Another category is industry self-regulation, which people are cynical about, justifiably. But that said, if you look at, in America, the ESA, the ESRB, which is the rating system, was basically the trade group saying, we're going to self-regulate. Everyone was skeptical, but it's kind of happened, and it has served some value to players and parents, the ESRB rating system. And that was the industry saying, hey, give us a shot at doing it ourselves. Is that better than the government doing it? Fair debate. Well, is it better than nothing? Fair debate. But that is another tool in the toolbox, which is industry self-regulation through trade groups, and there are trade groups around the world. The third one, which is the one that we've sort of alluded to, that I think is very powerful, and it speaks to the aspirational goal of getting it out there, is having key employees embrace it and just start the patterns of behavior in their own companies and in their own projects. And again, if this is a talent-driven industry, if the folks who care about and are making the games are saying, this is important to us, and they start doing it, it'll happen. That'll be a repeated pattern of behavior. And I'm seeing that with Playing for the Planet, with environmental commitments. I think it's happening with Fair Play as well. So it's not like it's all one or the other. All three are powerful ways to help move this process forward.
Thank you, Alan. I think Kate wanted to interject.
Yeah, well, we've been dancing around the topic and we've kind of brushed upon it a little bit, but I think it's time to talk about the cultural ethical relativism that is kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to this topic, because, as others have noted, we have spoken about this topic mainly from a Western perspective up to this point, and not only just political regimes and legal regimes that exist, like for example, the differences between the US and the EU, which are very real and substantial, but that's still the West. It's like I've done consulting work, for example, with Chinese companies, and I can guarantee you that a code of ethics is probably not going to exist. And if one does, with some of these companies I've worked with, and I'm talking about companies that are quite large and well known, it's going to look nothing like anything that we would come up with, and mainly because, as like Alan mentioned, and it's true in China and elsewhere where it's more extreme, their concept of ethics is going to be more about reinforcing whatever hegemony they are essentially pushing. And that's really what it comes down to with a lot of this. And ethics fits into that bucket of cultural hegemony. We're already seeing it with game content and how game content is allowed or disallowed in certain regions, and not just like, I'm not talking like ratings type content, like the big three of violence, profanity, and sex. I'm talking about all of the messaging and the implicit messaging that comes through games, the use of allegory and things like that, which more and more ratings boards in different countries are getting more in tune with in terms of what messages are coming through this content. And of course, they're already in tune with this with film and television programs and everything else, but they're getting more savvy about it with video games. And so I think it's just going to basically, I guess I'm adding a little petrol to the fire, saying it is going to be a very complicated issue. But so I could see us conceive of these code of ethics regimes that essentially reflect a certain aggregation of values in a region. And then maybe we find ways to translate and have those, have some level of interoperability between them, because I do think the baseline will be the same, but about as far as what we want to achieve in terms of a experience for players as well as for the workplace in games. But the reason for why it's being done will be vastly different.
Thanks, Kate. Did anyone want to add anything to this topic before we move on?
I think I have a clarifying question for Kate, which is, so do you think an outcomes-based code of ethics may be the place to start? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly, because essentially what do we all want at the end? Because if we start with the why, like we want a code of ethics because fill in the blank, which usually starts on some moral or ethical, or I should say moral or values-based realm of discussion, because it's, quote, the right thing to do. That discussion about the right thing to do already kind of torpedoes what could come after. So I think it's like, what do we all want? We want this, we want this, we want this. So I think if we look at it that way and kind of work backwards, I think that might be more productive.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, it's going to go too fast. We're barely scratching the surface here, so these are great points so that we can start and go beyond and dive into it. I just want to talk a little bit and take some time to talk about minors and children more specifically, because we can all agree that this is a population that we want to protect, and we can see that across the globe. Actually, like even in China, there's been laws to protect children. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to Miles and ask him what is your perspective, like a Sesame workshop. You not only have to talk to children, it has to be inclusive, it has to be benevolent. So how do you deal with that? What is your perspective on this topic?
As a nonprofit for a long time, we thought of not collecting data as an ethical value. We're gold standard, we're better than the rest. We don't collect data. So that was an ethical value. And we were quite, self-satisfied with that. And then now what we see is that parents are shocked, right? Like, my kid just logged in again and you don't remember what my kid did last week? How could it be that you don't know my kid? You don't know what my kid's interested in? Right. So now parents and users of all ages, children as well, have this expectation that there is in fact a persistent two-way know and be known relationship between media, including games, platforms, and themselves. And we are now compelled, frankly. It's now mandatory. We're a 54-year-old organization, so it can take some time to turn the battleship around. But we are having to very rapidly get to a completely different place in which we are being really super thoughtful and intentional about how we do instrument our games, how we do keep data and build profiles and present experiences that can be persistent across sessions, and where we can actually assess and build on where children are at from a skills and a progression point of view, and from an interest and preferences point of view, in order to ultimately lead to much better educational outcomes. And so, you know, to speak to that question of, you know, we want a code of ethics because, you know, broadly speaking, of course, we want a better world, but I think selfishly for Sesame, we are unable to do some things that people want us to do and that we should do. Social gaming is a very obvious example. Social gaming is obviously where it's at. It's very challenging, especially with a pre-literate age group, to be able to create interactions between children and other real children safely at the same time that it's absolutely necessary. And we're in this sort of time of real concerns about mental health. We have a fairly significant presence on Roblox, and this is, I think, one of the spaces where this is going to be tackled and hopefully solved first. And so we're, very, very hopeful that working with Roblox, that will be one of the places where safe social gaming emerges, and where that could be perhaps generative to some of the questions that are coming up here. The other thing I would note, and sort of follow on, is just that we right at the moment have a lot of conversations about the downside of competition, and that creating competitive play spaces and competitive gaming actually promotes toxicity currently in the culture. But guess what? Humans want to play games where they keep score. It's really fun. So right now I find myself having to push back internally against anxiety that, oh, well, if we keep score, if we allow children to compete rather than, force them to cooperate, it's going to lead to a lot of toxic behavior. It's going to lead to a lot of bad feeling. Again, this is just something that is so broadly broken that we, and I'll use Roblox as another example, not that Roblox is broadly broken, but that we're facing that same challenge. In fact, I think quite the opposite of Roblox. I think they're doing most things right. But I think that if we want to have 5-year-olds show up and compete against one another, and we want to do so in a way that does not promote toxicity and bad feelings and leave kids feeling worse, when they stop playing than when they started, we desperately need a code of ethics of the sort that this community is working on. So, it goes back to what I said at first. There's so many great things that we could do to help children and to educate children, and many of them we can't do because of these problems today. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. Gosh, we only have 2 minutes left. So for the panelists who need to go, feel free to go. We're probably going to go over a little bit. We will still have like 20 minutes to say goodbye, so we can take a little bit of that time to keep the conversation going. If no one wanted to add to what Miles was saying, I just wanted to talk a little bit about content moderation, and Kat did not have a lot of opportunity to talk, so Kat and Carlos, what do you think would be the most challenging elements, because content moderation is really important, and a lot of games are multiplayer, and there were a lot of discussions on the survey. Like, a lot of people were saying, well, how can we develop a code of ethics when players themselves may be unethical or even adversarial? To Maya's point, I think there's a lot of things that we can design differently so that it's not fostering too much competition or toxicity. But there's still that question how we can deal with that. And I know that take this, I also been working on extremism, how can also deal with this big issue that exists also outside of games. So maybe a question we can start with Kat. What do you think is the most challenging here in terms of content moderation, and would you like to speak on regarding this topic?
Boy, that's a hefty question.
I know. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so I think well, I feel like the question everybody raises with these like big content moderation systems is scale. And so games often have this like challenge that's in ways like much harder than social media platforms, where many games are you're a body in the world. It's doing behaviors, that's acting in certain ways. It's not simply text or images, right? And so thinking of how to scale systems where the information that's automatically collected of like toxicity using whatever, classifiers, using whatever AI technology we have, or large language models and things like that. So that when users want to advocate for themselves and report, like when abuse is happening to them, like how much agency do they have in being able to reflect their own experiences? It's often not much, because content moderation systems often, because they need to scale, think of like human behavior as like this single point of interaction, right? It's a single unit of content, a single unit of interaction. And so I think what's really important is like, how do we holistically reflect the experiences of players when they're experiencing harms in a way that's trauma informed, right? Because a lot of people do have a lot of negative feelings and association with, either their identity, their nationality, any number of things that can be used to harm them. Do these ways that users can protect themselves either through like protective features like muting or kicking people out of a game, or through reporting, how much do they have the vocabulary? Sorry, there's so many things to say about this, but essentially, yeah, how do you make these systems scale in a way that's like still very human-centered? And that is helps moderators understand best how to reduce harm, and how trust and safety, or, content moderation teams can build better systems and work with designers to account for, okay, if we're adding this feature to a game, what kind of toxicity is it going to introduce? And are we going to account for it before we introduce that feature, or being prepared early on? So I think there are so many different parts in this ecosystem, both in terms of like designing the system, implementing it at scale, and then making that system accountable and protecting the moderators, right? Because they're going to have to see a lot of that stuff. So it's like, are you prepared to support the moderators as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's also the reason why the code of ethics that we're trying to put together also is concerned with workers, because they're critical to the process. Carlos, did you want to react, because you work both on content moderation and with children? So is there anything you wanted to add?
So I think the main thing I really want to touch on here is looking at content moderation as a part of a larger ecosystem. Because when we're talking about content moderation, we're talking about something that is typically happening after the fact, right? The behavior has manifested, it's downstream, we need to deal with it. But when we are thinking about content moderation within the ecosystem of what I call player safety and different systems, game systems and social systems and things that are upstream that could lead to negative behavior, destructive behavior, I really think about this idea that not everybody experiences safety the same way. Right? Like I can almost guarantee here that if we take all 7 of us here in this call right now, and we get into brass tacks, we have different safety needs, right? We have different levels of comfort, what we're willing to put up with, and resiliency is different, and all those things, right? So why I say this is because just right there you can see that the potential pitfalls of trying to use a one-size-fits-all for some sort of ethical expectation in safety alone, right? And safety is only one element of ethics. So for this particular conversation, what I would like to encourage us to think about is when we look into the desired outcomes that Kate was talking about, I think that's powerful, right? Thinking about ethics, we're not just talking about bad stuff, right? We're talking about the ideal state of things. And when I think about games, I think about connection, sense of belonging, specifically multiplayer games, right? Creativity, the ability to do things together, to create and imagine things together. So I think if we are aligning around a rough set of principles of what we want to see happening in games, that's a really good start. And then we can hopefully align on a little bit on the flip side, right? What are the real destructive type of behaviors that run completely contradictory to the very purpose of online games? If we can align across the industry, we have this this shared language across that, hopefully there's an opportunity even to bridge across cultures. Because as we were saying, there is the challenge of different cultures and all that, but can we find a similar footing, at least for some of those negative outcomes that we don't want to see? So I would definitely encourage us to think in those terms. And one final thought here, which is more rhetorical perhaps, but just an acknowledgement. When you asked Celia of hardest challenges in content moderation, gosh, I cannot think of anything harder right now than moderating online communities, gaming communities, where there's discourse about the various conflicts happening in the world and different wars. What a hard thing to do. So I just wanted to put the empathy for everybody who's doing that job right now, because that is just fraught with bias, with all sorts of errors and misunderstandings. So I just wanted to say, I can't imagine a harder challenging moderation right now than that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's tough times, definitely. Did anyone want to add to this topic, or to comment on any other topics that we talked so far, or to start a new topic? You can also do that.
Carlos, I'll jump in a little bit on this. You know, where can we find common ground? And I think a lot of people want to find common ground around children and safety, you know, and there's some basic ideas of around grooming and radicalization and recruitment. But I think even there's different ideas about what it means to radicalize or recruit someone or groom someone culturally. And so I don't entirely disagree with you, but I wonder how far we can go in terms of in terms of shared standards around safety. And I also think that because some, I mean, culturally, and this comes up in mental health work all the time. It's why we work pretty much exclusively in a Western context. Take this, because mental health is culturally different across the world, and we can't make assumptions around collectivist responsibility versus to cultural norms versus spaces for exploration and experimentation that other cultures value for their kids. I mean, there's the really basic cultural differences that I think crop up a lot here, and on some level, I think that one of the things we have to consider is, how do we give cultures and spaces and people the opportunity, the flexibility to bring their own values to the table, as long as those values then don't hurt people who are not part of that community or not opting in? Like, how do we give as much choice as possible in spaces, recognizing that is also fraught, but that might be one lever to push?
Yeah, one thing that I also wanted to point out that also relates to a question that somebody asked in chat about, like, automated moderation. And I was thinking about localization in general, right? Like, where, like, so there's one issue of, like, companies in the US giving a mandate to people outside of the US, or localizing for outside of the US. So it's like you're just sort of transporting Western values through, like, a Google Translate, essentially, right, into these other spaces. And then there's also this component of, like, I feel like a lot of people, when they hire, like, teams and moderators, they don't understand the, like, the socio-political context, the regional context, the history of conflict within a country that, like, means that this is hate speech in a very particular way, that, like, I feel like tribal hate, for example, in that I sort of encountered studying toxicity in, like, Nigeria and Kenya. Like, tribal hate was not in a lot of policies for a lot of social media companies, and in many Western contexts we don't understand what that means. Like, we can sort of understand it in the context of racial hate, but there are so many frameworks that we have that don't even, that like trying to localize it doesn't even work very well because our systems are so ingrained in these very particular, I might even say like Californian values.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree, because I mean, I deal with that every day. I mean, that's partly why my job exists, is because navigating the localization and culturalization factors is pretty nightmarish. And yeah, I mean, as we experience across different regions of the world, it's like one person's hate speech is another person's cry for freedom. And how do you discern that, and what qualifies you to discern that, and based on what? And that really comes back to forcing companies that they are going to have to, whether they like it or not, as they've learned through several issues in recent years, like Black Lives Matter and other issues, the Ukraine invasion last year, what's happening in Israel and right now. It's forcing companies to take a stand, that they can't just hide in the shadows and sit, or just say, hey, we're just a bit, but it's like, yeah, but you're creating a cultural force, and you can't just take that excuse anymore.
Thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
and oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is sort of building on both the chat and this as well, is oh, and actually Kate, you said something cool in the chat. Yeah, I think one component of this is we do, I think AI automation of like moderation and stuff like that can be very helpful for for reducing harm and for scaling well. But I think a framework that's important to think about is not using AI to replace people, but using it to assist them, right? Like helping understand, like even helping people understand that cultural context, like searching a term, or just making everything available that a content moderator needs in front of them, or even trust and safety kind of person. So it's like, yeah, how do we make it so that automation is helping us practice our values rather than trusting it to act our values for us?
All right. I think we have to conclude. I would like to conclude with a great question from Adam Jarrett that can help us, maybe put an end to this conversation for today. And maybe if you can, each of you take like 10, 20 seconds to answer. So the question is, we're all here at the conference because we care about increasing ethical behavior, but how can we reach people who don't want to come to this table? I've certainly talked to people who don't think it's actually a good idea, or don't want to even have to tackle this because it's really complicated. So if you can, each of you, like, to take a few seconds to just say what would be the next step and how we can invite them to this conversation, and maybe convince them that it's something that we should do. Like, hopefully it's something we should do. We can all agree with that. Let's see who wants to start. Otherwise, I'm just gonna pick people in the list.
I'm happy to
Kate
say
has
something.
just unmute. Yeah, go ahead.
To me, it's pretty simple, even though it's pretty yeah, it's the unfortunate answer, but you got to tie it to money. How is this going to help the bottom line of companies in one way or another? And basically, how can it help the bottom line is the better response than how can it hurt it, because I think a lot of them already know how it could potentially hurt them. But it's the exact same thing I had to do when I was doing my culturalization work and having to convince companies that taking account of geopolitical and cultural nuance in their game content is really important. They wouldn't, and I kept telling them the reason to do it is because it's the right thing to do for the players, to respect who they are and the cultures they come from. That argument plays better today in 2024, but back when I started doing this work over 30 years ago, nobody gave a shit about that argument. So I had to basically say, well, the more you do this activity, the more you make your content viable in different markets, which then means you can potentially make more money, because your content will be, meeting local expectations around the world. And as soon as I tied it to the money argument, the light bulb went on for them, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to listen. And I don't like giving that answer, but I think for a lot of people, especially at the C-level in the industry, that connection has to be made in some form.
Thank you, Kate. Kat, do you want to?
Yeah, I think surveying what people are doing. Like right now, one of the projects I'm working on with Alex Levitt at Roblox is simply cataloging what every like user reporting form is. Like, what are all of the features it has? How does it work? So if we do even more of these types of surveys across companies, I think that also help us like name and shame some people who aren't doing it as well, but at least showing how well some people can do, practice some of these measures. So I'd love to see more of those types of surveys and cataloging, like what is really happening right now.
Thank you. Carlos, you're next on my list here.
Just a quick thought that I believe it's exactly the folks who disagree with the idea of this that probably would offer a lot of great insights, right? At least we need to hear their voices. So however shape or form that can be facilitated through conferences, to industry gatherings, but actively seeking dissident voices and understanding why people think it's a bad idea probably would teach us a lot.
Definitely. Eve, do you want to go up next?
Yeah, sure. I think these are great points from everybody, but I also think that one place, to Alan's point at the beginning about the different types of stakeholders and the different players in this space, there's so much diversity across this industry, and there's spaces where this is a welcome conversation and there's spaces where it isn't. And using the spaces where it's a welcome conversation to be generative and to create possibility and to create examples and models, and those will be diverse models, right? And then having those models percolate through the industry, both through the existence of them and through the fact that people are going to go from these companies into other places, and sometimes they'll go into and those conversations will percolate through. I think that's a shift that's really possible and really hopeful. Is that, you know, if we don't have to press the biggest levers or work with the biggest companies at the outset, and we can make these conversations, we can kind of embrace the diversity of the industry in order to get this started.
Thanks, Eve. And Régis?
I think I go with everyone on this point, and that I think the money is important, and you have to convince the big company that they have to tackle the ethics, and maybe to have a look at other businesses like the social media, like big platforms, and you know that in the end, many countries and regions like Europe are trying to tackle this topic, and with some fines and some legal new laws, and maybe you can try to work with the people who wants to do this so that you can achieve and have a critical mass. And when it's, you know, it's the same with environment. Not all the companies wants to go into the environment, or they didn't want, but now they have to, or they have to do as if they would like to. But I think that we have to work with the people who wants to work on it, and not using the cultural differences in the world as an argument not to start in the process. You know, we have to start from somewhere and to take into account all the culture, but we can't wait to agree with everyone to share these ideas and to build with the other people, I think. So we have to walk, maybe to run tomorrow, but we have to try to create with what we have now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I totally agree with you. You know, I'm coming from UX, so iterative design process is a good way to try to approach it. Thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to have this quite difficult conversation. So the takeaways for me is like we need more science. So all of you in the scientific community, thank you so much for participating in this conference and share your insights and your research and your outcomes, because we need more of that so that we can define harms versus moral panics. And also we need to define certain things like what does it mean to be safe, and depending on what context and what population. I also know that we have to be more diverse and multicultural, so that it would be great to find a way to invite more people to the conversation. Think of it as starting it as an aspirational code so that we can be broad and get people from the bottom up join us. And then also elements from this aspirational code can be taken by policymakers and regulatory bodies, as Régis was saying, so that we can enforce certain things when we know that there are clear harms. And yeah, money is an enforcing function, so that also can help convince the people who have yet to be convinced. Thank you again so much. This is concluding this panel. All right, so we're just gonna say goodbye. So thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Yves. Thank you, Régis. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Alan and Miles, who had to go. But thank you to them for joining us. And I would like to call up stage Sebastian and friends so that we can conclude and say goodbye. We're a bit over, so sorry about that.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for all the speakers, for all the panelists, and for everybody else who's been in the audience. Like, an online conference in the best of time is a real kind of marathon. So thank you, Celia, as well, for managing that. I think it's been an Herculean and excellent effort from end to end.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. This has been an incredibly informative 2 days and a lovely beginning continuation to a conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for being here. This is just the beginning. So hopefully we can have more conferences, more discussions, maybe some workshops. For the next steps, I'm just gonna share the screen again so you can have all the information, and maybe Claire can help me out here to share it in the chat. But here is the information that you need. If you want to get more information, you can check out ethicalgames.org, games.acm.org. The survey is going to stay up for a little while, so you can still add some stuff in the survey. You can answer it several times if you want to. You can also sign up to be informed, or also sign up to be included in the conversation. Feel free also to let us know if we should talk to specific people. What else? So the videos are, everything was recorded, and the videos will be online as soon as possible. So just give us a little bit of time to manage this and do the captions, so that we can do a proper job here. Again, I wanted to thank all of the participants. So first of all, the advisory board, the board members did an incredible job at managing this conference in a very short period of time. So as a little bit of a speed course here. Thank you so much to all the reviewers who again had to review all the submissions in a very short period of time. Thank you so much all the speakers and their co-authors who joined us and presented their research. Thank you to Claire for helping out in managing the day today and yesterday. Thank you so much for your help. And thank you to all of you for being interested in the conversation, for joining, for your great questions and comments. And we all hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.